All right, I think that is. I think it's a good time to get rolling. So first of all, thank you all for attending. This is a panel discussing all the fun stuff on SSNs, both current and future. First of all, my name is Joe Stuntz. I'm the Vice President of Cybersecurity here at One World Identity, previously with the White House Office of Management and Budget, in charge of identity initiatives for federal agencies. So I love SSNs. But I will say that my job here is to ask the questions and stay out of the way. I also would love all the questions from you all as well. I think I know what you all want to hear, but I'd love to hear it from you all. We have the experts up here to answer these questions, so please take advantage, jump in. We will do a Q&A at the end, but if something strikes you during the discussion, please stand up and we'll get a microphone to you. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. They all have impressive backgrounds, which will give you all the comfort to ask whatever questions you'd like, because they will know the answers. So first, Ms. Brandi Travis from Aristotle.
Hi, I'm Brandi Travis, the Chief Marketing Officer of Aristotle, and we provide a solution called Aristotle Integrity that does Asian identity verification.
Next, Jeff Miller.
I'm Jeff Miller. I look after fraud and identity solutions for TransUnion, both here in the U.S. as well as international markets. And obviously, TransUnion is probably familiar to most of you. And interested and excited to be on this panel.
I'm Blake Hall. I'm the founder and CEO of IDMe. We're one of the current NIST-approved identity providers for citizens to log into government agencies through a shared service. So it's sort of like single sign-on with Google or Facebook, but for legal identity. 8 federal agencies are using us now. California is integrating us for voter registration and driver's license updates, and we're doing some stuff in healthcare. So the premise is that once you've verified your identity, you can take it with you across our network.
And I'm Chris Ryan. I'm with Experian Advisory Services. I've been with Experian for about 11 years, focused on our fraud and identity practice. In that time, we've gone through 3 platform releases, all focused on aggregating Experian data sources, and more recently, a number of non-Experian data sources to provide sort of comprehensive analytics and workflow capabilities around identity verification and ID proofing and fraud risk determinations.
So I'm going to get started with a fairly open-ended question. If this is the only question we get to because you all want to jump in, that's great. As the panel description of this says, which is in all your agendas, there are places where the SSN is valuable and can still be used despite all the data breaches that we know about. And there are places where the SSN is not appropriate. So please jump in and provide an area where the SSN is still appropriate, because I think there is more awareness of probably where the SSN shouldn't be used. Where, in your opinions, is the SSN still valuable and still should be used? And where are some areas where you think it might still be used and it shouldn't? So I will open that up to anyone who wants to start. Chris, raise the microphone first.
I'll take low-hanging fruit for $500. A Social Security number is still appropriate, obviously, for half of the administration of the Social Security process, right? A permanent identifier that follows you throughout your working career, against which multiple employers can make contributions for your Social Security benefits, and against which you make contributions to your Social Security benefits. That's all, I think, an essential use of Social Security number, its original intent. And when I said half of the Social Security process, what I deliberately omitted was getting the money back out, right? So there's still the vulnerability that someone could attempt to represent themselves as you on the back end of the process. But I think as far as having, again, a permanent identifier that follows you through life, that allows those benefits to accumulate to determine what you're going to have available to you when you reach retirement, I think that's still an appropriate application for an SSN.
Anybody else want to take that one?
I think there's a few principles that when you're talking about legal identity and you're talking about uniquely describing a person, Social Security numbers are very important. How do you tell 100 John Smiths who share the same date of birth apart? You need that, and the permanence is very important. But once you understand the identity that's being claimed and its uniqueness, for legal identity, you should use other methods like devices and biometrics and government identity documents to actually make sure that the user who's claiming that identity is in fact that person. So the 2 questions are, whose identity is being described? Is it unique, and is there a permanent identifier? How do we know that that person is in fact the actual legitimate owner of that identity? That's one way to think about it. There are other contexts, though, where you can uniquely describe a person outside of legal identity without using social security numbers as well. So if you wanted to verify that a particular individual is a student, and you had, Blake Hall, Vanderbilt University, and Vanderbilt could say, yes, there's a Blake Hall who's enrolled right here, that would be an example of where you could uniquely pin somebody without using a social security number. But for legal identity, social security numbers are still very valuable as a unique, permanent describer of an individual.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Blake says, right? I mean, I think the fault lies where you assume because someone has a name and social that you verified or authenticated those consumers, right? It is very beneficial to zero in on, there's 100 Jeff Millers are very common names, and so which Jeff Miller am I actually talking about? But that's just one step, and now you're saying, okay, now I know which Jeff Miller I want to verify or authenticate. What are the other methods, device, carrier verification, document authentication can you use to actually go to the next step? So I think social is around. I think if you talk to a financial institution, they've built their infrastructure around it, and I think ripping that out is going to be pretty complex and take a long time. But I really think it's less about the number, because any number that you have can be hacked and will be breached. So if you get rid of social security number and you assign another unique identification number, that'll be breached at some point in time as well. So I think it's really around how do you use identifying information to determine which person you want to authenticate, and then use other means to authenticate that they are indeed that person.
Yeah, and I agree with both of you in saying that we could do the document authentication and then also the biometrics, and for data points using unique data, and we even go as far as doing something off the registered voter file as a unique data field.
So that is exactly what we were hoping to talk about. Jeff, you actually got into it a little bit. The process of ripping something out based on you've heard different political statements that we should get rid of the SSN. Jeff, you alluded to this. What would the cost be to an organization, to any of your organizations or clients that you don't need to name, if the political will said we are going to move from the SSNs as soon as possible, whatever that means in government time?
So I can't.
And I can say that now.
It's a pretty broad question. So I can't necessarily tell you the cost, but I can tell you the risk and some of the perils that perhaps it would entail, right? So we've been weaning ourselves on reliance on a full SSN for quite some time. A lot of times we're only getting last 4 digits, and depending upon the application, like insurers are sometimes hesitant to ask for SSN. So we're looking at name and address. So I think from an infrastructure perspective, we've been looking at that as a way that we can limit our use of SSN. That being said, the less identifiers you have to zero in on the person you're trying to authenticate, the higher opportunity there is for you to incorrectly identify that individual you're trying to authenticate, or I think more damaging would be incorrectly associate information about someone that you're not quite sure about, right? So our ability to merge data together and with confidence to say, this is Jeff Miller's credit history, or this is Jeff Miller's mobile number, the less identifiers you have, the more likelihood that there is going to be a mistake. You talk to banks today, even with SSN, how often they're able to follow a customer between card, DDA. They're all still struggling with it, or at least a lot of them are, right? So I don't have an answer. I just say it's difficult and it has some perils.
I agree with Jeff, and I think that it's and you alluded to some of the downstream impacts, right? So it's not just when we strip out social security numbers from the process, yeah, it's going to make organizations like ours more challenged to resolve to an individual. But the downstream impacts of that are going to be on each and every one of us as consumers, right? So now what happens when there's some question, right? So I'm Chris Ryan, I change my address at the end of the month, and for some time period I can't be distinguished from any other that may share the month and year when I was born. So unless you have some other really consistent identifiers and can really resolve to that identity, it's going to be more challenging. And again, that's going to come down to a slowdown for some people who get caught in that sort of ambiguous, that gray area where the identity can't be resolved. How do you provide them services? How do you give them real-time access to things they want? So it's an impact on individuals and the companies that provide B2C services.
Sure. So my next question, we actually have a panel next door after this called "Is the Phone Number the New SSN?" It's going to be great if you all are looking for another panel after this. So I'd open that up a little more broadly. So as you all work in your day-to-day lives, what alternatives are you seeing that are gaining adoption? What are alternatives that you hope don't gain adoption? Is the phone number is one sort of number? Is that the way we should go? If you could, if you were in charge, what would you do around alternatives for SSNs?
So the good thing about using a mobile phone number is that you get the two-factor authentication. But another method, like I was talking about before, is using something off of the registered voter file. So that could be anything from party affiliation to anything else, the last time they voted or something like that. That is a unique character. That's something, and also something that you can't find readily online.
So I think there's three principles, right? Uniqueness, permanence, and then interoperability, and I'll kind of walk through. So uniqueness is important. Think about a Twitter handle, right? You can know what somebody's Twitter handle is. You can know what Justin Bieber's Twitter handle is, but good luck authenticating to that celebrity's account because you don't know their passwords. And if we think about name, date of birth, and social security number as our legal kind of handle that uniquely describes us, it's fine as long as it's divorced from the passwords that are used to claim that identity. One of the issues with phone numbers is going to tie back to permanence. Well, there's two issues really. First, 20% of Americans over the age of 65 don't own a cell phone. So if you use mobile phone numbers in lieu of social security numbers, you've just excluded seniors, many of whom might need to access secure healthcare applications online from your kind of new regime. The second thing is that phone numbers don't have the same permanence of a social security number, which is ascribed at birth. So if I were to verify as ID me that this is Blake Hall and this is a current address and everything else, and then I go back to a federal agency like Veterans Affairs, and I go, hey, here's Blake. I'm not going to pass you his social. I'm going to give you his address, and I'm going to give you his phone number. They're not going to know how to match me to my records because the VA's got my social. They might have my address. I think the last time I interacted with them, I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so 5 Copperthwaite Street, and they've got my Massachusetts phone number and not my current one. So that brings me to my third point, is that if you lose permanence, you lose interoperability because you need to be able to match the identities across boundaries. So there are a different number of ways to achieve it, but you have to have uniqueness, permanence, and then interoperability that will actually work across organizations that need trust and identities and organizations that are issuing them if you're actually going to get to the services that are the whole point of this conversation, like patient-directed data exchange, citizen access to change their direct deposit on their Social Security, going to register to vote. So those are at a high level, kind of the structural elements that we look through when we're talking about different options.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think the phone number on its own doesn't solve any problems. I mean, to your point about over the age of 65, and also, carriers, between 1 and 2 million changes happen between consumers every single day on a carrier network, right? I change my carrier, I change my phone number, I cancel service, I add service, so that permanence becomes a problem. That being said, if you take the phone number and you're able to link it in real time to a carrier, right, and you have some permanence, or you say, okay, well, Jeff has been with AT&T for 10 years and it's at that same address, then I think absolutely that provides an opportunity to provide further authentication and verification of that consumer. I just wouldn't necessarily use that as the sole matching algorithm, as you said, because of permanence and other factors. And also it gets complex. It sounds very easy on the, at the high level, but then, well, what if I'm on my company plan? Do I get to keep that number when I leave the company? Or what if I'm on a family plan or my parents are on a family plan? I mean, it becomes a little bit complex. I think phone numbers and carrier data as a mechanism to verify an individual, I think is absolutely something that is being looked at and should be looked at. I just don't think it's the solution from a unique identifier perspective.
Sure, I'll ask a couple individual questions. Again, if anyone has something, raise your hands, jump up, let us know. So Blake, as someone who builds, trying to build identity solutions for a lot of the population that may have coverage issues, thin files, whatever your term of preference, how does the SSN play into ensuring appropriate population coverage? You mentioned the 60, people over 65 and their lack of mobile phones in certain cases. How do you think about the SSN and population coverage?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think one way to structure this problem is how do we uniquely identify somebody here in the United States or in the developed world, and how do we identify somebody in the developing world? But of course, it's not that black and white. There are populations here within the United States that also bear remarkable characteristics to trying to establish uniqueness in the developing world. So let me break that down specifically. Like, if you're in India and you're trying to verify a farmer who's got a single name and knows what season that he was born in, but not his exact date of birth, and there's no records that you can point back to, you probably want to start with a biometric like that individual's face to uniquely describe that person because you're starting from scratch. And that's exactly what India has done with Aadhaar. But notice that even like our sort of breached and leaked social security numbers, faces are also public. So it's fine if the identifier is public. It's okay as long as you've separated usernames from passwords. Now, when you're talking about the United States, you have students who might not have started their financial life, or they're on their parents' utility bills, and so they're very good at taking selfies and using authenticators and keeping accounts secure from takeover, things like that. But as far as like even knowing that the identity exists, much less the person is legitimate who's trying to claim it, is very difficult, because where do you find them? I think there are definitely opportunities to leverage healthcare. I mean, healthcare identity literally starts at birth, and if we can do a really good job of credentialing patients in healthcare and making those credentials portable, healthcare is a natural identity provider to financial services and to government to open up accounts. So that cross-sector portability is really exciting. But that's really what you're talking about, is that if you can't reach out to a data aggregator or to a credit bureau to say, hey, is this name, date of birth, SSN valid? And they go, I don't know. You have to have alternative methods, and that's where we focused our efforts on a lot of the in-person touch points where you might be able to have that individual bring in like an identity document or even using the face as unique identifier. You still run into interoperability challenges, though, in that well, there's two things. Like, if the identity is new, you might not have a matching issue because you're actually helping establish the identity. But if that individual is trying to access something that they need from a government agency, it becomes very difficult to pass over like an image of a face and try to match that to a record, right? So those are some of the edges on the issues. But I think having social security numbers is an enormous advantage for us because, my former life, I was an Army Ranger. Like, if you can track somebody with biometrics, if cameras can know that that's your face and they know your identity and they can watch you without your consent, there are enormous implications that are negative for privacy. Whereas somebody might have my social, but they don't know what my face looks like. They can uniquely identify me, but not track me. That's actually a really important advantage of our current regime. We're just not using social security numbers properly. So I guess it is a very nuanced question, but demographics drive everything when it comes to this challenge.
Yeah, I mean, just one comment out of that. I mean, Aadhaar, I spent 3 years in India, and Aadhaar, a tremendous amount of effort and Herculean effort. I mean, what they accomplished was actually truly amazing. I just don't know if that would ever happen in the U.S., right? I mean, personal privacy is fundamental here. People don't want to register their guns. People, if you said everyone's got to line up and register themselves as a citizen of the United States, I don't think any politician is going to be reelected with that as their platform, right? So, it's fundamental that that's not going to probably be a solution in the near term for the U.S. So we need to look at different ways. And SSNs, there is the downside, right? So, we worked with a company to identify a synthetic population on their portfolio, and they had actually ended up going to the FBI, and the FBI was able to get a warrant to go to the SSA and did some analysis, and found that 80% of the social security numbers that were synthetic were children under the age of 10. And so you think about some social that's now being used associated with a different name, and those consumers or those children now become 18 and try to enter the financial service institution, and their social is tainted. So that's going to be a huge challenge. I know. My last point, I guess, is that there is some language in the Senate Bill 2155 that directs the SSA to make a service available to confirm or identify a social in an association. And I think that would be beneficial in terms of protecting those people who have had their social misused.
All right, we have a question from the audience. Yell it out, and I will repeat it.
Hi, Claire Nelson with Cedici. So in 2011, the method by which Social Security numbers were created shifted from being a set pattern to being almost random. Can you comment on that, especially in terms, you mentioned the magic word synthetic identities, and there was supposedly, it depends on who's measuring, a rise in synthetic identity theft, fraud, creation, etc. So not all Social Security numbers are created equal, and I bet that all of you on the panel would have a different spin on that.
Sure. So I think SSN randomization is definitely an impact. It's having an impact already, as Jeff mentioned, and I think that impact is going to worsen as more of those get issued. Right. The people who have the first ones are still very young. So when all those people are adults, it basically, we've talked about some other types of data that can be used to assert and resolve and authenticate people, right? And one of the interesting things about like a phone number is if you can get the carrier data, you can confirm ownership, right? Or if you know someone has used a specific internet-enabled device and you've established that that's their device and you can recognize it when it's represented. There's factors other than the piece of data itself. There's use and association over time, which are important as well. And with SSNs, prior to randomization, you could at least associate a person with where they were, or roughly the geographic area where they came from, and when that number was issued. So there's some correlation between date of birth and number and geography and number that was useful as well. So you don't just make it. You don't just make the randomization doesn't just affect the issuance of the number itself, but there are additional factors associated with the number that they're going to be impacted as well. So I think it's the impacts we're seeing now are just beginning.
Yeah, I mean we look for more proof of life factors, right?
Yeah.
So has someone had a speeding ticket? Well, you're probably real if you've had a speeding ticket. Do you have relatives? Right? If you've got relatives, you're probably a real individual. So we're trying to identify ways that we can have proof of life elements that would point that that's not a synthetic identity, that's a real person.
All right, thank you for the first audience question. So Brandi, I'm going to turn to you for the next one. As someone who works in the political identity space as well, trying not to lose the panel down a particular rabbit hole, what are you hearing from your customers around, are they comfortable with the voter rolls being secure? How are they looking at using the SSNs or using alternatives that you all may have on the voter rolls?
Yeah, so our clients range from everything from elected officials to government agencies. We also have gambling companies and everything down to adult website companies. And the security of our data is extremely important. So we use everything from, when we're talking about identifying someone, just using one data point isn't secure, and it really depends on the level of authentication that's required. If it's a high risk, then we would use more identification methods. We would start with data. So, like we were talking about earlier, there definitely is a place for age, date of birth, address, but then the alternative data forms, and then also the document verification, and then the face verification. But with the alternative data methods or data points, the registered voter file is extremely important. And a lot of our elected officials use that to verify that people are who they say they are, or that people are actually in their district and identify their voters.
All right, I have more. All right, Jim in front.
So, just a quick summary is you're saying identifier yes, authenticator no. Broad
Yeah.
brush. I know it gets more nuanced. The question is, should we even be looking for a single answer to this problem, or should we immediately assume that there is no such thing as a single answer to this? Because all it does is set up another iteration of this. How does it look then to say, how would you make decisions about parsing off specific pieces of that to go move forward with, rather than trying to solve it all at once?
I honestly think it's just an education issue. I think that a lot of companies haven't taken action to separate usernames from passwords. One of the leading blood works companies in this country, you can use name, date of birth, address, and last four of social to get access to somebody's blood work. So you could literally take any of the breach data, target rich zip codes, blackmail people at scale, like right now. So there's just like a basic industry awareness problem where, I don't know who the CISO for that company is, but they need to do a better job. And then, and if there's legislation that says you cannot use static identifiers to verify that a user claiming identity is in fact that person, that would be helpful. This notion of killing the SSN, I think, is harmful because the SSN is fine as long as it is used in its proper role, and NIST has done a lot of work to advance that. And we've talked a little bit about the phone, but I just want to give a quick plug for the phone because we've been able to demonstrate now at several agencies that you can have much higher access rates by eliminating the question and answer process that we're all familiar with to verify identity and actually have zero fraud. So this thing knows where you woke up. It knows that we're all together in a room right now talking for the last few minutes. It knows how long you've paid your phone bill. It knows what cell phone tower you're pinging. And if there's been no SIM swap or phone port of that device to a different carrier, it hasn't been taken over and there's been no change, it's very easy for legitimate users to say, hey, telecom provider, release my history. And there's a saying in banking called over the tenure of an account. The longer I know you, the better I know you. So if you've got a legitimate person who has paid their phone bill for 7 months, they are pinging a cell phone tower within a mile of their address of records, there hasn't been a SIM swap or a phone port, it would mean that for a bad guy to take over your identity, they would have had to pay your phone bill and be standing outside your home with a verified device to take it over. And so some of our partners like Payphone and Denal who are out there are doing a really excellent job at helping telecom data come in for the verification steps.
All right, sir.
Synthetic identity
Yeah.
that's been on books for 5 years would meet all of those criteria.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
challenge with synthetic, because a synthetic identity would get a phone, right?
I have 236,000 of them in the portfolio I oversaw at a very large national bank. I thought that was a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I think you could throw stones at anything. That's definitely part of.
236,000 wasn't throw stones. That was a fundamental problem that created a regulatory challenge the size of the whole of outdoors. But then when you introduce something like telephone numbers, we have a challenge with FIDO because I can buy 10, or a synthetic identity syndicate can buy 10 iPhone 10s, iPhone X's for cash and enroll them with 10 different biographies and still enroll the same biometric face, and they would authenticate but have 10 different personalities and create a profoundly false sense of security around the biographies.
I understand your point. I think the NIST guidance does a lot to address the vulnerabilities of each control in the process, because you're right, there is no one silver bullet in any method that mitigates risk. But if you've pinned identity in records to know it's being described, if you've got a phone with tenure, if you've got a government identity document like a passport or a license, if you've done a biometric match to the face, and then if you've enforced uniqueness to make sure that the same identity can't be registered twice, and you're also using a lot of behavioral analytics and like looking at the IP address and all sorts of stuff in the background, through the combination of controls, it's almost like protecting nukes from getting launched. Like, yes, you could breach any one step, but to get all the way through the layers would be prohibitively expensive even for one credential. That's the name of the game. The question, of course, is how do you map those steps to the incentive that the user has? This is why like the DMV is a miserable experience, but it's actually quite useful for the economy because that miserable experience produces a credential that all of us trust, right? So what's the online equivalent for that? And that incentive component is really important to get somebody to upload their passport and take a selfie and do all these steps that most people, they look at an extra data field and they just want to skip out of the process.
All right, so I have to do the mandatory blockchain question, as this is an identity event in 2018. So how should blockchain be used with sort of unique identifiers like an SSN? Is there a use case? How would it be used?
No one wants to take that one. Look, I mean, is there a place for blockchain? Certainly. It's just a technology, right? I mean, I think a lot of people are throwing blockchain in, and they're using blockchain, but it could be the same problem could be solved in another way with technology. Just they chose blockchain. I think where blockchain is beneficial, if it's a mission critical or a government function, if you have a distributed network, I think there's some benefits to blockchain there. But there's also, you think about the triple blind or the double blind concept, right? The problem with that is if you get to the keys to the kingdom, right? If you get in, no one can really track the history. Where have you been? What have you done? And then to break that glass, is one, a procedural nightmare, but then it calls into question the whole, anonymity aspect to it. So is there an opportunity for blockchain? I know Canada's, the government there is using blockchain, as well as some of the banks are partnering there, and they're trying to do that here. So is there an opportunity to use it? Yeah. Do I think it's, the game changer that's going to solve all of our problems tomorrow? Not as I've seen yet.
So we actually do offer token authentication. We partner with a company called AV Secure, and it works really well for adult websites where people don't want to put their information in because they're afraid that it'll be tracked. So we don't capture any of that personal information, and then the logins are actually encrypted too. So the site operator just gets a report that says, X amount have failed or X amount have passed.
All right, I have more questions. So you mentioned ADHAR earlier, and I'm glad you did that. So what lessons can we learn both positively and negatively from what they've done over there? Should we make, my former boss at the White House said we should just publish everyone's SSN. He's in the room, but I'm not going to give him credit. Should we publish everyone's SSNs, make that the username, and make a different password? What lessons can we learn from what India has done?
I think there's a lot of positives there. I mean, I think the challenge, and I guess fingerprints are getting better on device, but I guess the iris scanning by device, but a lot of that's expensive and requires expensive devices and requires point of sale. I think for me, voice is an underutilized biometric because I think it can be used anywhere. So I'm actually a big believer in voice. But I think there has to be government and industry commitment if something like that's going to be undertaken. I'm not sure that the U.S. is ready for that particular step. But for India, the level of corruption and basic services were not getting to the citizens that needed them most. And this was a very critical step for India, and I applaud the effort that they've put in. And we're integrated ADHAR, and it's certainly making our customers' lives easier in India. So that's me.
I think part of what we're talking about is government embracing its role as an attribute provider, and I'm fully supportive. We should publish Social Security numbers. It would go a long way towards eliminating synthetic identities, which costs the industry billions of dollars. Like, you could wipe that out by having sort of a gold copy reference to do a lookup to make sure that this identity hasn't just been minted out of thin air. But there are other things too, like verified income from the IRS or from Social Security. Right now, if you live in a low-income housing tax unit in this country, they are required by law to not only have your tax information, but all these employer interviews and documents that they keep on premise for at least 15 years in a fireproof cabinet. So if you believe that some of those property management employees aren't using that data to file false tax returns, you're maybe more trusting than I am. But I think if you just had some APIs where you could query a verified identity against the IRS and say, is this individual's income below this threshold, which would make him or her eligible for the low-income housing tax credit? Yes, great. You just verified a claim instead of keeping all this raw data stored where all sorts of folks who have no business having access to it have access to literally all the raw data that can be used to perpetuate tax fraud. So you think about that, I mean, that's a $20 billion problem, tax fraud each year. Why don't we have a way to register identities and use a phone to stop tax fraud? If somebody's filing a tax return in my name, why don't I get a notification on my device if my device has tenure and is trusted? This low-hanging fruit that can literally wipe out billions of dollars of waste, but it will only happen if the government and each agency kind of steps forward and embraces its role as the authoritative identity provider for the aspect of identity that is relevant to it.
All right.
Just a point of clarification, when you say publish the SSNs, do you mean in some sort of private mode that's only available for the legitimate reliance?
So the current Senate bill that's been passed and is still in reconciliation says the Social Security Administration would need to make it available to a financial institution as defined by the GLBA. So that would be banks as well as credit bureaus would fall under that definition. I don't know if I'd be supportive that, anyone can look up, on a website, right? I spent 6 years in South Africa, and you could actually send a text with an ID number and actually get a credential back, which was just crazy to me. So there has to be some controls around it, right? So I think if you're a registered institution, you should have access to it.
Yeah, I think without knowing what was proposed, I think that's right. Like a registered institution, an accredited identity provider, and then using some form of like hashing where the PII is going one way. It's going from the organization querying the government, and the government just gives like a thumbs up or a thumbs down is probably the right way to hit it.
Yeah, I'd agree. And Social Security number, or at least SSA's ownership of Social Security numbers, is a source of truth, right? And to the extent that could be mined and better leveraged for a number of restrictions and a number of technology capabilities to make that smooth and to make that less vulnerable. I think that would be helpful, right? And certainly from a synthetic identity standpoint, knowing that an individual is associated with the number they provided at least gives us a sense that it's an actual existing number and that much more of it is known to be correct.
Yeah, and one of the things we're also doing is working with some of the financial institutions. A lot of synthetic identities are created through authorized user accounts. So you get a credit card, you assign an authorized user. Depending on the institution, there's either no or some level of verification on who that authorized user is, right? We've seen instances where one credit card has 400 authorized users, right? So is that really viable? So short of the SSA making their data available, I think there's some other smart things we can do to identify and slow down synthetics.
All right, with the last 10 minutes, I'm going to turn it over to you all. So please raise your hands, ask questions. Again, I can keep going. I would rather give you all the floor. Oh.
Question around, it sounds like you guys are doing a lot around how to identify this as a real person. But how would you go about, from an organizational standpoint, of identifying that, authenticating that real identity is actually the person who did it? So when I hear a lot of is just attributes and verifying those attributes, but not the person. As another individual has stated before, Face ID, anything like that's just a token when it comes down to it.
Sure.
How do I verify that that token actually belongs to that individual?
I'll take that one if you like. So, I think we touched on this in a couple different ways in this conversation, and the gentleman in the front made the point that a Social Security number and all these attributes are valuable for resolving an identity and figuring out, is this the individual I'm talking about? Now, the next level of question is that individual, how those attributes represent the individual? Now, the next question is, am I actually talking to the individual that those attributes represent? And at Experian, our approach is that there's a lot of value in velocity, in co-occurrence. So there's combining these attributes and their usage and presentations over time, their usage and presentations across a life cycle. To your point around synthetic identities being, authorized user associated, absolutely, the way that people evolve in the credit data that we have access to is a part of that as well. So I think it's important when we talk about the SSN, it is an attribute. It helps us resolve to the individual. There's a whole other discipline around the analytics and the technology that go into, do I believe there's risk in this presentation of this identity, even though the identity looks accurate? And I think that brings in, the phone, the biometrics, all the other pieces we've brought in today.
And I think the challenge, like we're talking about all the challenges, and so what do businesses do? They throw a lot more roadblocks, right? And so when we talk to our customers, it's how do I passively authenticate as many consumers as I possibly can, right? I was on a large bank's website, and I was 3 pages in, and at the bottom it had, percentage completion, and I was at 5% after 3 pages, right? So that must mean there's 30 or 40 pages of application forms to go through before you get to the end. And you as a consumer look at that and say, ugh, the abandon rate is 60 or 70%. So in our view, we're really looking at passive and digital authentication and leveraging as much of that data. Like if I've been logged into my primary bank account for the last 5 years and the bank has never reported a problem with me using that device, most likely that's a good one, right? And you're not going to solve for the 100%, right? We're trying to solve for the 99% because 1% or 2% is getting through the day, and if we can keep that the same but create a seamless user experience, that will be a huge win for our customers. So yes, preventing fraud is important, but for us it's around how do we ease that consumer experience and keep fraud the same. For any of our customers to talk to, they would buy that all day long.
All right, last question from me, I promise. So we have some government folks both in the room and at the conference more broadly. So what would you've mentioned a particular bill, you've mentioned SSA using APIs. If you had one sort of policy or programmatic recommendation to government broadly, what would be? And Chris, I'll start with you and then work back to Brandi.
Sure, I think that we could stand to, in the current context, have some consensus, right? So, and when I talk about consensus, when we think about identities, they really, I try to divide them into tiers, right? And tiers in terms of trustworthiness. You just mentioned someone whose device you've seen repeatedly using the same device over and over, presenting the same credentials over and over, not acting with a velocity or detecting anything that's suspicious about the way that identity is being presented. The part of the challenge is that when there are regulations put out or guidance published, that it's kind of soft around what the requirements are, right? And there's always going to be somebody who's got an interest in pushing the envelope, which is, I'm going to accept this identity at a very low level of verification, and that's the ticket, right? Once they're in, and whether that's creating synthetic identities or creating other problems in the ecosystem, that's kind of where it starts. So I think if the guidance around how we use information to identify people, if it at least had some floor, some minimum requirement, or at least was tiered to say, you can take some defined amount of risk based on the level of verification that you have, that might be very helpful, right? So then you can at least have your very trusted identities and your, I think they're okay, but I'm not exactly sure, and the ones you've never seen before, and if we could do something around how we manage those brand new identities, so that we have more confidence in them as they sort of evolve through those stages, I think that would help.
Yeah, I think this is a hard question because there's so much. But one of the main things too is color of money. It's intuitive as an entrepreneur. You walk into the Internal Revenue Service and you go, "There's $20 billion of waste from tax fraud. So if we can cut that sucker in half or 75%, there should be funding for that." And actually, there isn't, because different buckets of money. Like, you can save all that funding, but it doesn't mean that the group that's tasked with providing those secure identity verification services actually would realize the savings. So I think a lot of it is just like, how do you empower and incentivize these agencies to go out and to really innovate and then take advantage of the savings that their innovation generates for their agencies. It shouldn't all be sticks. We can put some carrots out there. And then The second thing is common sense legislation. Identification and verification are two very separate things. Let's make a clear line in the sand that there are just some uses of static identifiers that are no longer acceptable, and that's using static identifiers as a password. The final one I would say is that there's got to be a regime and a paradigm for government to act as an attribute provider. And if we don't do this, if we don't fix identity, there are going to be more foreign actors who undermine our democracy. Our voting system is a mess. Synthetic identity is a mess. It's not just one thing. We're failing as a country. And until we actually have an initiative, and there's actually continuity behind the initiative, I've certainly got some scar tissue with Connect.gov and a whole bunch of stuff where new leaders come in, they change the policy 180 degrees. That lack of continuity is a real problem within government. So all I know is that it's very important for us to get it right because there's a lot of bad actors who are out there trying to exploit us.
Yeah, I would agree. I think government plays a critical role in this. I mean, this is not a problem that industry can solve on its own. I think government has to take a primary and leadership role in this. I think, if there's one thing, I do think SSA, transparency and verification would be one. And then, I find government to either to move very, very, very slow or to move very, very quick, right? Problem with moving very slow is you never get anything done. Problem with moving quick is they're not necessarily thoughtful, and so you end up with a bunch of loopholes, or it's not a well thought out, bill that ends up being passed, and it tends to be passed in times of crisis, right? So something blows up, and the legislators rush to pass legislation to try to block that, and sometimes it succeeds, but a lot of times it doesn't have the intended consequences it did. Certainly we would look to partner with government. As you said, there are consumers that are being hurt and punished by this every single day. There are victims that haven't yet come of age that, if we don't fix this, are going to be prejudiced. So it's something we have to fix.
We think that that the government should get involved with how data is actually stored. As you know, there have been a ton of data breaches in the past year, and especially when it comes to if you're looking at the 2016 election, I mean, there were hacks left and right. And, if we're ever going to look at online voting or doing anything like that, we've got to get a handle on that before going into that.
Perfect. So thank you all for listening and the questions that were asked. Please give the panelists applause.